All right, welcome everybody to this week's Rising Tide Foundation weekly lecture, where I am extremely happy that we are joined by Caleb Maupin, who has been my friend now for a bit, and I've had a chance to read through some of his works, his books to follow. I also enjoyed your recent interview that you just had with ooh, drawing a blank all of a sudden. Your interview with Roger Waters. Wow, that was a weird mental fart I just had there. So I'll just share that too once this show is up. Now, Caleb has impressed me with his sensitivity to certain underappreciated elements of the origins of this parasite that has taken control of much of the US establishment culture and world more broadly, and has run roughshod, destroying a lot of great potentials that had emerged in the wake of the victory of the Allies over Nazism, over fascism. And there were some beautiful ideas put forth by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his allies in the Soviet Union. But Eisenhower, at different moments, his better moments, also tried to fight to revive certain positive ideas for a world without empire, and which John F. Kennedy and later his brother tried to also revive with Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, trying to revive a certain orientation towards breaking humanity free of systems of empire and exploitation. And unfortunately, because of our lack of appreciation of this parasite, of this new reformed deep state structure of a transnational nature, people have permitted for these potentials to be sabotaged. And now we're living in the wake of our choice to ignore this thing. And Caleb has noted in recent presentations a certain Trotskyist quality to it that I find was bloody fascinating. I'm here not just referring to the neoconservatism as a paradigm, but something more, even bigger than that. So Caleb agreed to give us a formal presentation today, which is going to be recorded. Again, many links are going to be available as supplementary reading, viewing material for under the description box of this video once it is up on YouTube. So check out that for additional resources. But once the formal remarks are finished, I'm asking people to put their names in the chat box, like we usually do, or put your little digital hand up, and I'll take note and call upon you in queue to be able to ask Caleb any questions you have in mind. So without any further ado, Caleb, the stage is all yours.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, Matt, for that lovely introduction. And I will do my best to present the information. We obviously are paying attention to the backdrop of more turmoil and intelligence manipulation of U.S. politics than we've seen in quite some time. The country is still reacting to the horrendous murder of Charlie Kirk, and also the people all over social media celebrating it. Also, it appears that while Donald Trump is trying to, at least on some degree, negotiate with Russia, the peace talks, etc., Tulsi Gabbard has stripped of the security clearances many of the people in the intelligence apparatus who were involved in the Russiagate hoax that was used to delay peace. And all of that gives an opportunity for a historical conversation. I saw that there was quite a bit of discussion happening about the neocons and who the neocons actually are. And I thought, I've done quite a bit of research about that over the years. I was a member of a Trotskyite organization, and in that organization, we studied the split in 1939 that laid the basis for the New York intellectuals breaking with Trotsky and moving toward the CIA. And so that whole history doesn't get talked about. And when it does get talked about, it gets talked about in kind of a shallow way. You first heard people during the Bush years refer to the neocons and how they had previously been Trotskyites. And it was often like in libertarian circles, people would refer to it, and they would say, well, these neocons, they all used to be Trotskyites. Well, communists are against freedom, and the neocons are taking our freedom away. So that's what it must be, right? Is that they just hate freedom. More recently, we've heard from voices like Nick Fuentes and others, a kind of classical anti-Semitic narrative that, well, the communism is all a big Jewish conspiracy, and these Trotskyites are all Jews and Zionists, so it's just that. Well, none of those narratives offer to actually tell the story of why it is that so many people that were advisors to the Bush administration, the people who crafted the academic school of what they called Sovietology in the 70s and 80s, that so many of them had roots in the Fourth International and in Trotskyism. And I realized that I needed to tell this story because this story has not straightforward been told. There have been books that have touched on it published. Alan M. Wald, his important book, The New York Intellectuals. There's also Frances Stone Sonder and her book, The Cultural Cold War, Who Paid the Piper? And then there's also the actual smoking gun. You can read the writings of Leon Trotsky, of James Cannon, of Max Shachtman, of James Burnham, and others, and you can learn this history. But I decided I had to publish this book to just kind of give the story of how it is that the neoconservative political trend that Tulsi Gabbard is fighting against and that Trump is battling against as his administration is trying to improve things with Russia, how that trend has a connection and kind of an intellectual trajectory tracing itself back to one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. So, the story it's basically a story in four parts. And I'll just try to go over the facts quickly. So first of all, who was Leon Trotsky? Well, Leon Trotsky was born in Kherson, which is a territory that is currently disputed in the special military operation. It was part of Ukraine when the borders of Ukraine were drawn, but at the time he was born, it was just part of the Russian Empire, and there was no real Ukrainian border in that time. Trotsky was born there to a middle-class family of some wealth, and he attended school and got formal education in Odessa. And at the time in Russia, there was the revolutionary intelligentsia. There was a widespread layer of educated young men who were interested in radical politics. And this was all over Europe. Coming out of the French Revolution, you had the Bohemian enclaves in Paris and in London and in Vienna. You had a layer of people that were interested in radical ideas and had formed various radical groups. And what is not widely acknowledged by Marxists, but is something that must be acknowledged if you want to understand all of this, is that all those circles were, just completely infiltrated by various intelligence services. The British intelligence agencies had infiltrated a number of the radical groupings. The Germans had their own intelligence agencies, the Austrians, the Turks as well, and that in the lead up to World War I, the revolutionary intelligentsia of Europe was very heavily infiltrated, and it was used in all kinds of schemes. And Leon Trotsky, he was born in the Russian Empire, but he almost immediately went into exile and was just kind of a well-known Russian exile in Vienna, in Paris, in London, and in New York City. And his mentor was a man named Alexander Parvus. And Alexander Parvus was also born in Russia, but fled to Germany, and was eventually elected to the German parliament as a member of the Social Democrat Party. And it's very well established now that Alexander Parvus became an asset and an agent of the German intelligence services. And Trotsky credits Alexander Parvus as being his intellectual mentor, and says that it was Alexander Parvus that first developed and helped Trotsky develop the theory of permanent revolution, which is this notion that countries that were not fully developed with industrial capitalism couldn't have full socialism, that if the working class were to take power in a country like Russia or a country like Vietnam or Cuba or on the African continent, because these countries weren't fully developed as capitalist countries, the working class could take power in these countries, but when they took power, they should just exist as kind of a base area to spread the communist revolution to Western Europe where it really mattered. And that Lenin and other Bolsheviks put forward the notion of the workers and the peasants having an alliance. Lenin called for a revolutionary dictatorship of the workers and peasants. Trotsky rejected that, saying that the peasants were an inherently backward class that could not have revolutionary potential. The other thing is that Trotsky spent a lot of his time in exile as this well-known Russian Marxist, advocating for the United States of Europe, or the European Union. He went around advocating that the European countries all unite into one European Union to break down national divisions. And the idea was that the German workers and the French workers and the British workers and the Belgian workers would all become one country, kind of modeled on the United States. It would be the United States of Europe, and that would break down national barriers and eventually lead to some kind of workers' revolution because there'd be more workers' solidarity. Lenin opposed this because he said that that if there was more unity among the colonial powers, that would lead to further subjugating the oppressed and colonized people of the world. And Lenin argued that dividing the British and the French and the Germans and the Belgians, dividing them against each other, would actually benefit the people of the colonized world. And so rather than trying to unify the Western countries, it was better to break them apart and emphasize the divisions between them so that the colonized countries could break free. And that Bolshevism developed in Russia as a completely new and unique spin-off of Marxism. And this is something we often forget, especially in America. Marxism is just synonymous with communism and with the Soviet Union. That was not the case. There was a whole Marxist movement in Europe. They called it themselves Social Democrats. It was the Second International, the Socialist International. Bolshevism was a completely weird, very uniquely Russian spin-off that developed a new theory that capitalism had entered a stage of imperialism. It was dominating the world with this system of imperialism, and it was the bankers and the financiers that were holding back development around the world by keeping countries in poverty, and that it was necessary to form a party of new type, a highly disciplined, clandestine organization that would struggle to seize power through means of agitation and propaganda and take control of the government, and then it could break the country out of imperialism, and that it would be the struggle of the colonized people in the global south to break out of the domination of imperialism that would bring socialism into the world. Now, that was a break from what Marx had said. Marx had said it was the Western workers in the most advanced industrial capitalist countries that would rise up and seize their factories. Lenin is saying it's the struggle of national liberation. And Trotsky is swimming in this same milieu of the Second International of Marxism. And Lenin comes forward with his theses and announces he's forming this party of new type, this Bolshevik organization. Trotsky is friendly at first and then ultimately rejects it. And when the Bolsheviks form their own organization in 1912, Trotsky goes elsewhere and he forms something called the August Bloc, which is his attempt to build a more radical wing of social democracy, of the mainstream, like the British Labour Party, the mainstream social democratic parties. He doesn't want to form a new organization. He forms his August Bloc. Now, Trotsky is living in New York City at the time of the Russian Revolution, where he's just a very, very well-known Marxist writer and speaker. And he has kind of a reputation. He has a Russian language newspaper for Russian radicals who fled to the United States. It's called Novi Mir, New World or New Peace. And he lives in New York City, he lives in Brooklyn, he lives in the Bronx for a while, and he develops kind of a reputation. One hilarious anecdote that you'll find many places is he refused to tip in restaurants. He would frequent the restaurants and cafes, and he would refuse to leave a tip, and when the waiter would bring the bill, he would give them a condescending speech about, well, you should form a union, you shouldn't have to depend on tips from guys like me. And, you know, that's kind of the personality that Trotsky develops. He's just known to be this very, very intellectual, kind of snobbish, Marxist, well-known. The Russian Revolution, the February Revolution happens, and the Tsar abdicates, the provisional government comes to power, and all the Russian exiles, all the radical intellectuals that have fled Russia are going back to Russia because they see this as an opportunity to create, you know, a communist revolution. Bukharin is living in New York City. Trotsky is living in New York City. Trotsky and his organization, they go back to Russia and they merge into the Bolshevik Party in July of 1917. And that's just a few months before the Bolsheviks ultimately seize power. And the Bolsheviks take power, and the Soviet Union comes into existence. First it's Soviet Russia, then it's the Soviet Union. And World War I is still going on. The Bolsheviks have taken power on a platform that they will end World War I. You know, and it's understood that Lenin received some support from the Germans. He came back, the Bolsheviks took power, their platform was peace, land, and bread. And the idea was that they would withdraw Russia from the First World War. However, now they've taken power. And a number of Bolshevik leaders, including Trotsky, say, well, now that we're in power, we're going to keep fighting World War I on a new revolutionary basis. And Lenin is saying, no, you can't do that. We promised to end involvement in World War I. We have to end the war. Trotsky is the foreign minister of the new Soviet Union, and he is sent to negotiate the peace treaty with the Germans. He goes to meet with the Germans, and he stalls, and he stalls, and he stalls, and he comes back with no treaty. And ultimately, he says, look, we can just continue fighting the Germans. And actually, he has this proposal called no war, but no peace, that they will never sign a peace treaty with the Germans, but they will demobilize the fighting. It'll be no war, but no peace. Now, that is rejected by the Bolsheviks. Trotsky is forced to step down as the foreign minister, and they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is largely in Russia viewed as a great defeat for Russia. They ceded huge amounts of territory, and if Trotsky had signed the treaty at the time that they was asked him to, they would have held on to a lot more territory. But Russia lost a lot of territory because of Trotsky's stalling of the signing of the treaty. And Trotsky has a faction within the Bolshevik Party they call the left opposition. And his primary disagreement with Stalin revolves around China and the issue of should the Soviet government support Dr. Sun Yat-sen and the nationalist KMT government in China or not. Trotsky says the nationalist KMT government of Dr. Sun Yat-sen is a counter-revolutionary government. It's capitalist. It's not sufficiently Marxist. However, Stalin says they should support the KMT because the KMT is representing the aspiration of the Chinese nation. Stalin orients the Chinese communists to join the KMT party as a faction, as the pro-Soviet faction of the KMT. Trotsky opposes that. And that is a primary disagreement. Trotsky rejects the idea of an alliance with what they call the national bourgeoisie. He calls for the independence of the working class, whereas Stalin is saying that it is important to form an alliance with the nationalist bourgeoisie to break nations free. Now, we know what later happened is Chiang Kai-shek became the leader of the KMT after the death of Dr. Sun Yat-sen. And then there was the White Terror, where the communists were being slaughtered. Trotsky blamed that on Stalin, and the language that is generally used, they say, Stalin sold the Chinese Revolution down the river. From there, the Chinese communists were forced to flee to the countryside because if they were in the cities, they were being killed. You had the brief uprising in a couple like cities like Shanghai and Canton. They had Marxist uprisings temporarily, but the communists are forced to flee to the countryside and they form a peasant army. Trotsky denounces that as well because he sees the peasantry as an inherently backward class. Trotsky flees from the Soviet Union and he moves to Turkey temporarily. And from there, he moves to France and ultimately he moves to Mexico. And it's in Mexico that he's ultimately assassinated by Stalin. But why is he killed by Stalin? And this is the important thing to remember about Trotsky is the reason he's killed by Stalin is because in the final years of his life, from about 1935 until his death, he's basically functioning as a professional anti-communist and an agent of the Axis powers. He's basically, at this point, the Communist Party, led by Stalin, is aligned with Roosevelt. They're part of the Popular Front, and they're supporting Roosevelt, trying to build an anti-fascist alliance. Trotsky and his followers call the Popular Front a huge betrayal, and they are trying to undermine the Popular Front. For example, one thing that happens is in Spain, you have the Spanish Republic, the elected government that is facing an insurgency from Franco, the fascist who is backed by Germany and Italy. Old Trotsky's followers in Spain launch an uprising against the Spanish Republic, which it's proven was actually funded by Italy and Germany. And it's the infamous term fifth column. It was the PUM, the Workers' Party, the Workers' Revolutionary Party of Spain, something like that launches an uprising, seizes Barcelona. George Orwell was there. He writes his memoir about it, demonizing the communists, homage to Catalonia. And it's this uprising that weakens the Spanish Republic and contributes to the Spanish Republic falling. Also, the Nazis are funding Ukrainian nationalism, right? Stepan Bandera, all of that. They're funding that. Well, Trotsky and his followers start building a movement for an independent Soviet Ukraine. And they're also calling for Ukraine to break away from the Soviet Union. And Trotsky's followers in the United States, in the lead up to World War II, they launch draft registration. Trotsky's followers are conspiring. They want to go into the military and form a union to disrupt the war effort. And so Trotsky's followers in the United States are prosecuted for doing so. And so Trotsky is functioning as a communist who's serving the Axis powers. And ultimately, as World War II is breaking out, he is assassinated in Mexico City by an agent of Stalin. Stalin, and he's killed. And Trotsky, he just kind of led a wing of Marxism. And Trotsky very much parallels the individual in German history and Nazi history, Gregor or Otto Strasser, right? When the Nazi Party was originally formed, there were two brothers that were part of it, Gregor Strasser and Otto Strasser. And both of them were Nazis, but on the night of the Long Knives, after Hitler took power, Gregor Strasser was executed as a rival of Hitler. So Gregor Strasser's brother fled to Britain. He had a radio broadcast from Britain claiming that he was the true Nazi and that Hitler had abandoned Nazism and abandoned the principles of National Socialism. And Otto Strasser was a broadcaster, a propagandist for the British during World War II, and he was the Nazi Trotsky, right? And the idea is if you're running propaganda and trying to disrupt your enemy, you don't just demonize their ideology, you also develop your own interpretation of their ideology with which you can confuse and appeal to people's, alienation from within. So, Gregor Strasser or Otto Strasser, his brother, they were the Nazi equivalent of Trotsky, and Trotsky was being boosted by the Axis powers as an interpretation of Marxism that could serve their ends rather than Soviet and American foreign policy. And that's pretty clear. There's other examples. William Randolph Hearst, the American newspaper tycoon who hated Roosevelt, published Trotsky's writings. The front page of the Journal American, from what I understand, at one point had, why the Soviet Union will fail, a direct interview with Trotsky, the leader of the Russian Revolution, why Stalin and his regime will fail. In Italy, the Mussolini regime published Trotsky's book, The Revolution Betrayed, in bulk and distributed it. And that Trotsky was the Marxist voice of the Axis powers, and that's why he was killed by Stalin. So that's part one. That's who Trotsky was. Now, part two gets to what happened in 1939. 1939 is a really important moment in world history. That's the year that the Second World War broke out. And in the fall of 1939, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The temporary non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Why was it signed? It was signed because the Soviet Union wanted to have an alliance with America, with France, and with Britain against the Nazis, and the Western countries wouldn't sign it. And the Soviet Union saw the Spanish Republic fall, and a government they'd been aligned with, the Spanish Republic, was toppled. And out of fear and desperation, they knew that the Nazis eventually wanted to invade them. In order to buy time and to take advantage of the rivalry between the Germans and the Americans and British, they signed a temporary non-aggression pact with the Nazis. It was not an alliance, right? It was a non-aggression pact. They drew a line down the center of Europe, and the agreement was the Red Army of the Soviet Union wouldn't cross one side, and the Nazis wouldn't cross the other side. And the Nazis invaded Poland, and when they invaded Poland, the government of Poland collapsed, and the Soviet Union then, as a defensive measure, moved its troops right up to that line. Now, it's commonly said in American media that this was a joint invasion of Poland. It was not a joint invasion of Poland because the Polish government in exile never declared war against the Soviet Union. The Polish government fled to London and they declared war on the Nazis for invading them. Never did they declare war on the Soviet Union. So it was not a joint invasion. That's the lie we're constantly told is, Hitler and Stalin divided Poland. No, they did not. Hitler invaded Poland. The Polish government collapsed and fled, and then the Soviet Union moved its forces right up to the line that they had agreed on in order to make sure that, as a defensive measure, because they knew the Nazis would eventually break the pact. However, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, the Roosevelt administration considered this a huge betrayal by the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had been their ally, and the communists since 1935 had been building a global anti-fascist front. And so they're going around talking about anti-fascism. Well, now they've signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Now the communists are emphasizing the need for peace and, engaging in anti-war activism. They're accusing Roosevelt of being a warmonger. So the Roosevelt administration is very angry at the Soviet Union. Earl Browder, the leader of the American Communist Party, is sent to federal prison on a minor passport violation. And the mainstream media in the United States goes into overdrive demonizing the Communist Party, saying they stabbed Roosevelt in the back. They're traitors, they're hypocrites, their anti-fascism is not sincere, they're just another totalitarian country just like Nazi Germany. Time magazine actually starts calling the communists the communazis to argue that the Communist Party and the Nazis and the fascists are the same entity. So, in this context, Trotsky, who is very much a sympathizer with the Axis powers, Trotsky actually becomes somewhat waters down his criticism of the Soviet Union because they are suddenly signing a non-aggression pact with the Nazis. And Trotsky supported the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Now, most Trotskyists kind of obscure this. He says it was not, signed in a principled way. He says the Soviet Union didn't go about it, but he says they had the right to do it. And Trotsky actually called on his followers to endorse Earl Browder in the 1940 presidential election and to engage in anti-war protests along with the Communist Party. Trotsky said the Soviet Union should have signed a treaty sooner with the Nazis, and he supported it. However, Trotsky's followers don't agree. And the U.S. wing of Trotskyism, Trotsky's international movement, it's the Fourth International, it's called, the followers of Leon Trotsky. Their wing in America is called the Socialist Workers' Party. And it's really two parties in one. On the one hand, you have the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters are a labor union of truck drivers. And in Minneapolis in 1934, the Trotskyites took over the Teamsters Union and they set up a general strike in Minneapolis. They won union recognition in Minneapolis. They then launched the Siege of the Midwest and they expanded the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters, you have to remember, are a Republican Party aligned union. They oppose Roosevelt. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, and then the CIO that emerges later, they are Roosevelt aligned. The Teamsters are Republican aligned. And that's a perfect place for the Trotskyists because they don't like Roosevelt and they don't like the Soviet Union. And Jimmy Hoffa, who eventually became the well-known kind of famous or infamous union boss of the Teamsters, was actually trained by Trotskyists. Farrell Dobbs, the leader of the Trotskyist Union, actually trained Jimmy Hoffa. And the Teamsters are this Republican union. And there's a lot of Midwestern people, Midwestern working class people who join the Trotskyists because they're the communist group that is running the Teamsters Union. However, in New York City, there's a layer of people that have joined the Trotskyists, separate from the Midwestern, working class labor guys, and they're the New York intellectuals. And they're grouped around a magazine called Partisan Review. And James Burnham, who I believe was the head of the Department of Philosophy at NYU, at New York University. James Burnham writes for Partisan Review, as does Sidney Hook, another well-known intellectual. And Partisan Review is this magazine. It was originally a Communist Party-aligned magazine. It went out of business, and then it was restarted as an anti-Stalinist leftist publication, Partisan Review magazine. And Sidney Hook and James Burnham and other well-known academics in New York City, they are the editors of Partisan Review magazine, and they are Trotskyists, and they are part of the Socialist Workers' Party. And they like Trotsky because to be a communist is a very trendy thing at this time. The Communist Party is very popular. They control 2 city council seats. They have their ally Vito Marcantonio in the House of Representatives representing Harlem. Roosevelt is a wildly popular president. To be a communist is kind of a trendy thing, but to be a Trotskyist is like a more radical veneer. The communists are toning down their message and emphasizing anti-fascism and aligning with Roosevelt. Trotskyism is saying that you're for the dictatorship of the proletariat, you're for the revolutionary working class, saying that Stalin has abandoned it and you're the true revolutionary. So among intellectuals, college professors, and others, to be a Trotskyist is a very trendy kind of radical thing to do. However, that changes in 1939. In 1939, when Trotsky is supporting the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression pact, and he's defending the Soviet Union and saying the Soviet Union is what he calls a degenerated workers' state. It's socialist in foundation. He's just against Stalin, its leadership. At that point, with the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany having signed a non-aggression pact, it becomes very, very unpopular to be associated with the Soviet Union in any way. And so the New York intellectuals announced that they are forming an opposition within the Socialist Workers' Party. And their 2 points of disagreement are what's called the Russian question. They don't think that Russia is a workers' state, but they also denounce the Cannon regime and the Socialist Workers' Party. They feel that it's becoming authoritarian internally. It's not allowing free thought. And there's a fight that goes on, and people call it Trotsky's final fight or the final conflict of Trotsky's life, where Trotsky and his American followers battle against the New York intellectuals, mainly led by Max Shachtman. And in 1939, it's a very intense fight, and Trotsky writes a book, about it. It's called In Defense of Marxism. And James Cannon, the leader of the American Trotskyists, writes a very good book called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. And in the fight, basically, they point out that the issue at hand is that all these intellectuals, all these college professors, all these writers, they're saying we want to think for ourselves. We want to think for ourselves. We don't want to follow the party line. We want to just think for ourselves. But think for yourself means following the mainstream media and equating Nazi Germany with the Soviet Union, and joining the mainstream American government kind of crusade against the Soviet Union and against Marxism. That's what think for yourself means. But they're doing it in the name of intellectual freedom. And Trotsky ridicules this, and he says, "Look, these people, they could support the Soviet Union through the Moscow trials, where all of Trotsky's friends and allies are being arrested. They could support the Soviet Union while it was trendy, but the second that the Soviet Union comes into conflict with the American government, that's when all of a sudden they've got to leave." This is an expression of their kind of intellectual pessimism and cowardice, is what Trotsky describes it. And it's a very heated polemic. And the point of party patriotism comes up, that the organization, maintaining the organization, is the most important thing, that it is expected that members of the Fourth International, members of the Socialist Workers' Party, defend the organization and be loyal to the organization, because without an organization, you have nothing. This is where the quote from Trotsky about the party is always right comes from. Whereas the New York intellectuals, they have no particular reason to be in an organization, right? If it'll advance their careers, it'll get them attention, fine. But they're not party patriots. They're not loyal to the organization. They just kind of are joining it when it's trendy, and then they're leaving when it's not trendy. And so the New York intellectuals, led by Max Shachtman, they have an ugly fight with Trotsky, and they leave. The Fourth International, and they establish themselves as the third camp Trotskyists, or the neo-Trotskyists, who broke with Trotsky shortly before his death. Now that's part two. That's the split in the Fourth International in 1939. So what happens next? Let's fast forward to after World War II, right? Before World War II, in New York City and in the labor movement, to be a communist was a very trendy thing. Communists were part of the Roosevelt coalition. Well, after World War II, it becomes the opposite. It's McCarthyism. The Communist Party is outlawed. The leaders are sent to federal prison. The House Un-American Activities Committee is riding high. Communists are public enemy number one. And during this time, during this period, the Communist Party of the United States does something utterly amazing. They're functioning as almost an underground illegal organization, but they're able to have the Waldorf Peace Conference of 1949 at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City. And they get Albert Einstein and Shostakovich and Aaron Copland and Lillian Hellman and some of the best writers and intellectuals of the time to speak publicly at this conference defending the Soviet Union. W.E.B. Du Bois is there, and it's a really effective thing. It's the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace of 1949. It's a really big deal. And the CIA is watching this furious. How can all these smart people support the Soviet Union? How can this happen? And at the time, the third camp Trotskyists, Sidney Hook, Max Shachtman, and the others, they formed the Committee for Cultural Freedom to protest against this conference, calling it they say it's not really a peace conference, it's just a Soviet, Stalinist propaganda conference. And Sidney Hook goes to the CIA and he says, give me $100 million, and I can create a movement of democratic unrest that will destroy the Soviet Union. And the CIA starts covertly supporting the Committee for Cultural Freedom, which eventually becomes the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and it is staffed by third camp Trotskyists. Irving Kristol, who ends up becoming the father of neoconservatism, was part of Max Shachtman's Workers' Party, and he is hired to be the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And Irving Howe, who is considered the intellectual father of Democratic Socialists of America, he is hired to write for Partisan Review, and this Partisan Review magazine starts getting funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and the Congress for Cultural Freedom is now today admitted to be one of the CIA's most successful programs. The CIA began funneling money to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, who paid Encounter magazine in Britain and Paris Review magazine in France and Der Monat magazine, that's the magazine of Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School. When we talk about the Frankfurt School, you're talking about the people grouped around Der Monat, the Partisan Review CIA-funded publication in Germany. And there's a network of these leftist magazines that are secretly funded by the CIA. and they hire the third camp Trotskyists, the people who broke with Trotsky in 1939. They hire them to write for these magazines. And the whole thing is that they're critiquing U.S. society and they're opposing McCarthyism, but they're also waging kind of cancel culture hate campaigns against the Soviet Union's allies. They go after Albert Einstein and say, how can such a smart man be an apologist for the Stalin regime? They go after the playwright Lillian Hellman, trying to accuse her of being a fraud and such. And they go after W.E.B. Du Bois, and they say, well, the communists don't really support black freedom, and they promote James Baldwin as a black intellectual who's anti-communist and will be opposed to W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson. And they're trying to infiltrate the circles and the places where the communists are gaining influence by creating a layer of people that are critical of American society, but at the same time very anti-Soviet. What's interesting, though, is they start completely changing what it means to be a leftist. This is the origins of the new left, right? Leftism is historically about the workers rising up against the capitalists, right? But if you read Partisan Review magazine, it's not about that. It's about intellectual nonconformity. Theodor Adorno is commissioned to publish The Authoritarian Personality, which is his big book that argues that the crimes of Hitler are rooted in the fact that there are some people who just believe that truth exists, that right and wrong actually exists and could join mass movements. And that the problem is this authoritarian personality. Susan Sontag launches her career as a cultural critic, Notes on Camp, and she eventually publishes an essay, Fascinating Fascism, where she argues that fascism is an expression of movements that celebrate strength, the choreography between leader and chorus, etc. And Hannah Arendt is among these third camp Trotskyists. She's a well-known associate of all these people. And Hannah Arendt, she writes the infamous book Eichmann in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann is a Nazi war criminal who's taken to Nazi Germany and receives the death penalty from Israel, or he's taken from Argentina and sent to Israel. He receives the death penalty from Israel. Well, Hannah Arendt attends the trial. And she writes this book that's widely circulated among leftists in the United States called Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Study in the Banality of Evil. And she says, look, Adolf Eichmann he was in the YMCA before he joined the Nazis, and he was just an ordinary guy because deep down, ordinary people are potential Nazis. And people need to be controlled, and they need to be heavily controlled because deep down, ordinary people are inherently anti-Semitic and are inherently authoritarian. Right? This is what's being churned out by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the new left of the 60s cultural revolution, is very much crafted by this kind of thinking. And it's not about class struggle. It's not about struggling for the workers to control the means of production. It's rather about nonconformity. And it views the people as the enemy. The masses of people are the enemy. And deep down, they are fascists. Deep down, they're authoritarian. It equates Nazi Germany with the Soviet Union. And they're both just expressions of the evil within the human spirit. It's this belief that human beings are inherently evil. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are an expression of what people actually believe. And the West is good because it controls the masses of people and does not allow them to set up authoritarian regimes that can threaten the freedom of the great intellectuals. And that's kind of what all these folks are thinking. So now we get to part 4. How did these folks end up on the right? Because this is the new left, right? These are the new left. Well, what happens? 1968, you have the Tet Offensive. The Vietnamese are winning. And you also have the Black Liberation Movement in the United States. The civil rights movement has evolved into the Black Liberation Movement and the rise of the Black Panthers. And even though the new left started out as something very much controlled to create a layer between dissidents in the United States and the communists, Students for a Democratic Society is waving the Vietnamese flag. And in addition to that, the Black Panthers are also aligning themselves with China and with the Soviet Union and with Mao and with North Korea, etc. And a lot of these New York intellectuals are at this point seeing the Stalinist threat emerging in the United States. They're threatened by it. But there's a much more important development, which is in 1967, you have the Israeli War, the 1967 war. And in that war, the Arab nationalist governments of Egypt and others align with the Soviet Union against Israel. And the new left, the campus activists and the Black Liberation Movement, largely opposes Israel and aligns with the Arab nationalist states. And these New York intellectuals are horrified by that. And Irving Howe writes an essay for, I believe it's the New York Times Review of Books, saying that opposing Israel is anti-Semitism, opposing Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. And you start seeing the New York intellectuals trickling into supporting Richard Nixon on the basis of he will crush the campus activist movement because it's too Stalinist adjacent. In 1972, Max Shachtman ultimately backs into supporting Richard Nixon. He at first supports a moderate Democrat, Henry Jackson, but then when McGovern gets the nomination in 1972, or McCarthy, right? McCarthy or McGovern? Well, in 1972, the Democrats nominated a far left candidate.
McGovern.
McGovern, yes. And because of that, Max Shachtman ends up supporting the Republicans. And the Socialist Party of America breaks into three factions in 1972. And one faction is the Socialist Party USA, which is led by pacifists. And they're still around. They run in elections. They're primarily an electoral entity. The War Resisters League and David McReynolds form the Socialist Party USA, which is kind of a symbolic political party that has a ballot line every 4 years. They run a candidate to kind of make a statement, and they're pacifists. They are opposed to all wars. There's another faction of people that are followers of Max Shachtman, third camp Trotskyists, and they are led by Michael Harrington, who served in the Lyndon Johnson administration. He wrote the book The Other America about poverty in America. He crafted a lot of the Great Society programs. He originally supported the Vietnam War, but by 1968, 1969, he sees that the USA is losing the Vietnam War, and he's, backing into an anti-war position. And they form the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. And it is a collection of CIA people. Gloria Steinem, the voice of American feminism, brags how her career started with the CIA and how she was sent to disrupt the World Youth Festival in Vienna. Irving Howe, who's been, one of these Congress for Cultural Freedom people on the CIA payroll, writing for Partisan Review since the 1950s. And just a whole collection of people. They formed Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which is now known as DSA. That's the DSA. That's the squad. That's AOC. That's their organizational roots. It goes back to Max Shachtman. But there's a third faction of people in the third camp Trotskyist current, these kind of labor union affiliated individuals, others, people from Partisan Review, that are so anti-communist they're supporting Richard Nixon. And they have Social Democrats USA, and they don't join the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, and they don't join the Socialist Party USA. They have their own group, and they're supporting Richard Nixon because he's anti-communist. And Jean Kirkpatrick is apparently among these circles. She becomes Ronald Reagan's United Nations ambassador. Carl Gershman, who headed the National Endowment for Democracy, was also part of these circles. He was a leader of the Young People's Socialist League and aligned with Shachtman. And it's a layer of all these people who are socialists, Marxists, but they're so opposed to the Soviet Union, and they're kind of organizing labor and student activist opposition to communist governments. What's interesting is Leo Strauss emerges. Leo Strauss was never a Trotskyist, but he is a philosopher, and he's a Platonist, a follower of Plato, and he becomes a very good friend of Irving Kristol, and he's giving classes to all these folks. And Leo Strauss, his whole book, his big book is called Persecution and the Art of Writing. And he argues that all the great philosophers of history have had to write in code because if the masses of people really found out what they really thought, they would persecute them. And that there are some people that are just naturally superior to others. They're the philosopher kings in the Platonic sense. And the masses of people will always persecute them. And so what he calls the noble lie is justified. That if the average people know what's really going on, they'll cause problems. So it's okay to lie to the masses of people. It's the noble lie that the philosopher kings have to engage in. Leo Strauss's favorite TV program is Gunsmoke, the cowboy TV show where the good guy wears a white hat and is all good and doesn't do anything wrong, no flaws. And the bad guy wears a black hat and he's all bad. He doesn't have a single redeeming quality. And Leo Strauss tells his followers that's how average Americans should be taught to understand politics. It should be Gunsmoke. The USA, all good. The communists or the authoritarian regimes, all bad. And Leo Strauss and Irving Kristol become very close. And neoconservatism, the neoconservative school of thought, comes to dominate an academic field called Sovietology that emerges, where they're training people to study the Soviet Union as a model for an authoritarian government and to believe that the mission of the United States is to overthrow authoritarian governments, and equating the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. Sovietology obsesses with finding parallels between the Soviet government and the Nazi government and arguing that they're both the antithesis of the American idea of freedom, and that the United States is on a noble crusade to overthrow these types of governments to protect the intellectuals, because these governments are just kind of incarnations of the internal evil of average people. And that the neocon school of thought crafts Sovietology. John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Elliot Abrams. There's a whole slew of people that come out of Sovietology in the 70s and 80s. They learn to speak Russian. They read all the Marxist classics in Russian. And their mindset is this: the communist governments are the incarnation of evil. Nazi Germany is the same thing, and it is the duty of America to go around overthrowing them to protect the great intellectuals. And that is the foreign policy mindset that kind of defined the Reagan and Bush administrations, both Bushes. It was that notion. And one common mistake I hear, RFK says that Brzezinski was a neocon. That is not true. Brzezinski disagreed and criticized the neocons because Brzezinski did not share their moralism. Brzezinski was obsessively anti-Russian, but he viewed it as a chess game, as a geostrategic chess game. He wrote the grand chessboard. Whereas the neocons, it is a moral question. And the height of neoconservative influence was the axis of evil speech that Bush gave after 9/11, where he says there's an axis of evil. These governments are an axis of evil. And Brzezinski at the time opposed that speech because he said, look, if you declare a government to be evil, you can't negotiate with it. And it might be strategic to negotiate with North Korea, might be strategic to negotiate with Iran. And if you just declare a government to be evil, you can't negotiate with it. And that Brzezinski is anti-Russian, he's a war hawk, etc., but he's not willing, he doesn't share this kind of notion of the USA being on a mission to overthrow governments. He rather views it as kind of a geopolitical game. Brzezinski is very much thinking about, Eurasia and the world island of Eurasia, and how there's the potential for Russia and China and the Eurasian superpowers to dominate the world, and he wants to align with America and Western Europe to keep that happening. And he views it as kind of a long strategy game of how to manipulate and make sure that Eurasia does not dominate the world. Whereas the neocons are not thinking about geopolitics; they're thinking about this noble mission, how there's the great intellectuals that are persecuted by the inferior rabble. It's the philosophical irrationalism of Friedrich Nietzsche. And later, you have Ayn Rand, which is kind of a bastardization of Nietzsche. This notion that truth doesn't exist and that great individuals with their willpower can create their own reality and truth and impose it upon the world. And that any attempt to create truth and create a grand narrative for human history is totalitarian, and that the only act of morality, the only moral thing that one can do is to deconstruct, to take apart narratives in order to create greater freedom. And this is postmodernism. And this is philosophical irrationalism. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, but this is the neocon worldview. Truth itself is totalitarian, and it's okay to lie to advance your agenda, and it is the willpower of individuals that can define reality. And there are some greatly superior individuals who refuse to conform to this world and live by any ethical and moral rules, and they are the great individuals, and that we need governments that protect such individuals and enable them to rise to the top and hold back the masses of people who are very dangerous. Now, obviously, you can see the implications of how this would be very convenient for those who believe in Malthusianism and the notion of overpopulation, etc. So that's the trajectory from Trotskyism to neoconservatism. And that's basically what you need to understand. Trotsky had this elitism, this contempt for the peasantry, and he built a movement. He broke with communism. Trotsky's followers broke with him. They founded the New Left, and eventually they laid the basis for neoconservatism. And it is an expression, I would argue, of philosophical irrationalism, opposition to truth and order, believing that the universe is defined by chaos and seeking to deconstruct.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Caleb, for delivering that impeccable presentation. I'm going to tell people in the audience right now, like I said at the beginning, if you have a question, put your name in the chat box. I'll call upon you accordingly, or raise your digital hand. If you want me to read the question, just read it out, write it out very, very clearly and concisely, and I'll read it for you if you'd prefer that. I got the first question though. I've read a number of works by Grover Furr, going through various angles and evidence that has emerged, especially after 70 years had passed and greater access to the KGB archives have been made accessible to researchers from 2000, I guess, 12 or so, showcasing more and more serious evidence that the Moscow trials were not fraudulent, but had a very good basis for happening. That is the Stalin herd of the various Trotskyist fifth columnists inside of Russia. Can you say anything about that in your research? Do you think Grover Furr's on a solid line of research, or do you have any qualms about his approach?
I have studied Grover Furr's work in depth. I'm not ready to completely embrace all of his conclusions, but he has shown some very important things. One thing that he has shown is that the Moscow trials, those are the purges in the Soviet Union, were the event that sparked them was the assassination of Sergei Kirov, who was a low-level Soviet official who was assassinated. The U.S. government, academia have spent millions of dollars trying to prove that Stalin killed Kirov himself as like a false flag to launch his purge. And they have spent millions of dollars trying to prove that, and they can't prove it. But that is such an important point of American propaganda against the Soviet Union. They're desperate to prove it, and they just can't find any proof of that. That's one thing, and Grover shows that. And it is the Russian Studies Department of Yale is just kind of the main place that all of this research to try and prove that the Moscow trials were based on a false flag, that Stalin set the whole thing up as a power grab. That's where it comes out of. Timothy Snyder is the head of the Russian Studies Department at Yale, and Grover Furr has ripped him to shreds, showing that his work, which is dedicated to equating the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, is just full of straight-up misrepresentations of the Soviet archives. Grover goes and reads the Soviet archives and shows that what Timothy Snyder cites them as saying, they don't say. And he just bluffs, and he assumes no one's going to go read the Soviet archives. And Timothy Snyder has spent his career saying that the Soviet Union was worse than Nazi Germany, killed more people than the Nazis, and it just doesn't match facts. Now, the other thing that Grover Furr has shown is that Trotsky was in communication with some Soviet government officials. There are mail receipts that are in his archives. He claimed that he never communicated with Bukharin, never communicated with Zinoviev. Well, it's proven that he was corresponding with them. So he was lying when he said he wasn't talking to these people who were convicted of conspiring with him and absentia. So those are all really important revelations. Grover maintains, though, that Trotsky was actually, in collaboration with Germany and Japan consciously. I don't know if I can confirm that, but it doesn't matter. Trotsky's movement, the Fourth International, was aiding the Axis powers. They were working against Roosevelt in the United States. They were trying to hurt the Spanish Republic. They were trying to break Ukraine away from the Soviet Union. Whether Trotsky knew it or not, he was, in effect, aiding the Axis powers because he was opposed to the Soviet government.
Okay, I've got a ton more questions, but I'm going to withhold for now and let Richard pose a question. Richard?
Well, my question is about David Rockefeller, because I've always had this opinion that he had a lot of power in formulating things, and he was completely left out of your story, except you did mention Brzezinski, who was one of his agents. Is there anything useful to say about David Rockefeller's role or non-role?
Well, the Rockefeller family were on Roosevelt's side. In the lead up to the Second World War, there was a big divide in American politics with the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Morgan and Henry Ford, basically opposing Roosevelt and being somewhat sympathetic to the Axis powers. Whereas the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, and I believe Chase Bank and others, they were supporting Roosevelt because they were in an alliance with the British and they wanted to dominate trade routes, and they saw Germany as a threat to a global power. And so the Rockefellers supported the Roosevelt coalition in the Second World War. And then later, Rockefeller money was key in funding the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And that's one thing that's pointed out. It wasn't just taxpayer money from the CIA. It was Rockefeller money. The Rockefeller think tanks, the Rockefeller foundations were funding all of this academic work that the so-called New Left comes out of. At the same time, they were funding modern art. They were also funding Planned Parenthood, which used to be called the Birth Control League. That was a Rockefeller project as well. The Rockefellers were in the Republican Party, but they were pushed out by they basically hated the John Birch Society, and they didn't like Barry Goldwater. And that, it's, I guess, in the 1964 election, there's a quote where I guess one of the Rockefellers said something to the effect of like, there's a whiff of fascism in the air, and that they felt that McCarthyism had created kind of a populist anti-establishment movement that threatened them. And the John Birch Society and the kind of populist right wing of McCarthyism targeted the Rockefellers and condemned them. And so they were very much alienated from the Republican Party. The rise of the neocons gets the Rockefellers back into the Republican Party, right? It kind of secures their grip. That right-wing politics had been dominated by kind of populism, John Birch Society, McCarthyism stuff. They didn't like that. The neocons made the Republican Party safe for the Rockefellers again.
Thank you.
All right, Kelly. Kelly, you're on mute, by the way. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay,
Yeah.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I have a lot of questions, but I'll just
Pick
give
one.
one short. Yes, one short one here. You mentioned about the Trotskyites, and they kind of split up into different factions later on. Can you expand more on were they the New York intellectuals? Like, who were they, and what did they represent?
The New York intellectuals represented a layer of very well-educated people in New York City, grouped around Partisan Review magazine, who joined the Trotskyist movement and broke with Trotsky in 1939. And just very quickly, if you look at people around the world nowadays who talk about being Trotskyist, Trotskyism is mainly a Western phenomenon. You don't really see it in the developing world that much. Communism is very popular in countries like India and places like that, but you don't have Trotskyists, right? It's mainly a Western phenomenon. A couple places you'll see it. In Algeria, Trotskyists had some influence. In Latin America, they've gained some influence in the Bolivarian groups and stuff, but it's largely a first world phenomenon. And among Trotskyists, you generally have three types. You have the first, which are the third camp Trotskyists, the ones who've cut their ties with the Soviet Union and all the socialist countries and are primarily academic. And for many years, the main organization of third camp Trotskyists was the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, which is now part of Democratic Socialists of America. And they're funded by a nonprofit called Haymarket Books. And Haymarket Books is funded by the estate of Henry Wallace, the Wallace Global Fund. And they are a nonprofit that funds and kind of cultivates third camp Trotskyism, very anti-Russia, very anti-China, but done in the name of Marxism and workers' power. And the ISO and the third camp Trotskyists, they're kind of the people among the third camp Trotskyists who never became conservatives and did hold on to, the notion of being socialist and Marxist. That's third camp Trotskyism, and it's primarily academic, and it's funded, through academic outlets. There's another current of what you can call mainline Trotskyism, and those are folks that are they do labor activism. In Britain, a lot of them have joined the Labour Party. They were supporters of Jeremy Corbyn, and they don't like Russia and China, and they don't like modern-day communist governments, but they also are somewhat critical of U.S. foreign policy, and they tend to focus on economic issues. Shama Sawant, the city council member in Seattle, comes out of this. She was in Socialist Alternative. Now she has her own grouping, right? And these are the mainline Trotskyites, the USSWP, the militant tendency, and then there's a third current of what you call orthodox Trotskyism. And this is a wing of Trotskyism that's very, very esoteric. Orthodox Trotskyism is, you get Jerry Healy, who was a very important pro-Palestine activist in Britain. I believe the National Caucus of Labor Committees and the LaRouche movement actually traces its origins back to Orthodox Trotskyism. You have the Spartacist League and groups like that. And those groups tend to be, pretty much in opposition to the American status quo, and often they're persecuted by the government. A lot of them are a little bit strange. There was one of these groups that was really into UFOs. They were followers of I can't even remember the name. It was from Argentina, and they had kind of an international network, and they were like UFO Trotskyists. You had the Spartacist League and others, and there's kind of an esoteric wing they call Orthodox Trotskyism that is a bit more sincere, I would say, than the first two categories. But the third camp Trotskyists, at this point, they are pretty well organized into DSA, but Haymarket Books is still paying them. That is the outlet that kind of pays them.
Have you noticed, or in your work, any connection between Trotsky or the Trotskyists, and have you looked at the Russian Fascist Party of World War II that was sort of based in northern China and had a strange, embarrassing. Well, they were working with the Nazis very, very openly, but they were also a little embarrassed because they were trying to publish Hitler's texts into Russian, and the parts where he was trying to, where Hitler's pretty passionate about the idea that the Slavic people are a sub race or a subspecies was a bit tough for them to try to like regurgitate and rebrand, but they still did it anyway. But do you know if there's number one, do you know anything about the Russian Fascist Party, which is very difficult for me to look at or to review? Not a lot of good history work has been done on it. And is there any connection to Trotsky in that?
Well, I know that there were a number of Russians who opposed the Bolsheviks who fled. But then when World War II broke out, they were divided. Some of them were so opposed to the Soviet Union that they were sympathizers with the Nazis. And some of them still supported, the Soviet Union against the Nazis in the name of being loyal to Mother Russia and the homeland. And during the Second World War, right, Stalin legalized the Russian Orthodox Church. Stalin made films glorifying the great czars. Ivan the Terrible is a great movie that was made by Sergei Eisenstein during the war that has a lot of Russian Orthodox prayers in it. And that Stalin, he pivoted in a way that a lot of Russian nationalists and others that would be sympathetic, that would be put off by Marxism, would be sympathetic. So the Russian exile community was heavily divided. I know that much. The other thing is that in his final year, 1939, Trotsky published a biography of Stalin, which is called Stalin: An Appraisal. And the first 5 pages are dedicated to arguing that Stalin is, quote, Asiatic, and that he's not Western. And it's just blatant racism. And it compares Stalin to Genghis Khan. It talks about a mix of shrewdness and cruelty that is unique to Asia. It is some of the most racist stuff I've ever read. But Trotsky loved the West. Trotsky was in love with Western Europe, and he very much saw the Third World as inferior and backward. And he saw Stalin, a guy born in Georgia who attended a seminary school. He saw Stalin as somebody who incarnated this kind of third world barbarism that he opposed, and he saw incarnated by the peasantry. So that is an interesting factor to put into it. But as far as this particular group and any relationship they had with the Trotskyists, I can't point to any direct connection that I'm aware of, but I'm just giving you the context.
Yeah. I just pulled up a little quote from Trotsky when he was still, I think he was still like the Minister of Industry or something in 23, 24. And he wrote this pamphlet, and I got to just read it. It's so over the top. But it really situates him in the eugenics transhumanist camp pretty deeply. And he writes, and I'm quoting directly from the pamphlet: "The human species will once more enter into a state of radical transformation, and in his own hands will become an object of the most complicated methods of artificial selection and mass psychophysical training. This is entirely in accordance with evolution. Man will make his purpose to master his own feelings, to raise his instincts to a higher consciousness, to create a higher social biological type, or if you please, a Superman."
Wow.
Yeah,
well,
straight up.
That fits. It's interesting because one thing I do talk about in my book, I have this book that I wrote on this, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives. Probably the biggest contribution that Trotsky made to the Russian Revolution was he was the front man for the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. And it's fascinating what that actually involved. Is he went from military base to military base on a train, giving these kind of propaganda shows. And he wore this like elaborate costume they gave him with like a long leather coat and leather pants and like a military visor. And they would set it up so that all the soldiers who had tried to desert, they would line them up before a firing squad, and they'd be like going to be executed. And Trotsky's train would arrive just in time, and he would get out of the train and save their lives. It was like staged. It was fake, but they didn't know that, right? And Trotsky would save their lives. And then he would gather the soldiers around, and he would give a speech that was like dedicated to the guys who had tried to desert, to tell them why they should fight for the Red Army. But it was a propaganda show. And this is a tactic that a lot of like tent revival preachers would use. It's called the anxious bench, where it's like you say, is there anyone who's questioning their faith? Come down to the front. And the pastor preaches the sermon to them with the crowd kind of cheering to hope that the people on the anxious bench will repent or whatever and convert. And so Trotsky would do the anxious bench to the soldiers that were thinking about deserting. And it was a really powerful propaganda show that he would put on. And then he would end the show by picking a random soldier from the crowd and taking a gold watch out of his pocket and awarding that soldier a gold watch as like a prize. It's like Oprah giving everyone a car or something. And that Trotsky was really, really good. These propaganda shows that Trotsky put on for the Red Army were very, very effective. And he just went from military base to military base putting on these shows. What's interesting is I think that Nazi propaganda probably was heavily influenced by that, right? What we saw later with Hitler and the Nuremberg rallies was probably heavily inspired by it. We know Joseph Goebbels was a really big fan of the Battleship Potemkin. That was like Joseph Goebbels' favorite movie, which was the Bolshevik propaganda film. And that, when you think about Hitler in front of the audience in his like Nazi costume, giving him the fiery speech, you can almost argue Trotsky probably invented that to some degree or other, which I think is amusing.
That's hilarious. That's bloody hilarious. Okay. Since nobody has other questions in the chat, I'm good. People, I encourage you. Now's the time to put your name in the chat box. But I got another question, so I'm just going to take advantage of that. Spanish Civil War. So, in what way can you expand a little bit more on how the Trotskyists sabotaged the resistance to fascism and Franco in Spain?
Right. So the Spanish Republic comes into existence. The king is like brought down, and you have an elected government in Spain. And the communists have a lot of support among the trade unions and others. And communists are elected to office. And the Spanish Republic is a leftist government. It's not fully communist, but a lot of communists are represented in it, et cetera. And then General Franco, who's a general based in North Africa, and he has actually an army of a lot of people that are like North African or Moorish, right? He then brings his military back to Spain and launches an insurgency to overthrow the republic to restore the monarchy, right? The idea is he's going to restore the monarchy. And at the time, right, in Spain, among the left, you have the Communist Party, which is the biggest faction, and they're supporting the Spanish Republic. And then you have two smaller organizations, the POUM, which stands for like the Workers' Party, the Workers' Struggle Party, something like that, POUM, which is the Trotskyist aligned party, which is like a breakaway from the Communist Party. It's followers of Trotsky as well as followers of Bukharin, who was the right oppositionist. And then you have the CNA, which is a labor union that's run by anarchists. It's an anarcho-syndicalist labor union, right? And so those are the three leftist groups in Spain. And the Communist Party is elected in the Republic. And when Franco launches his insurgency, the Spanish Communist Party starts calling for communists from all over the world to go fight in Spain to defend the Republic. You have the Abraham Lincoln Brigade of American volunteers, and it's a civil war that goes on. The POUM, they have their own like militia that is part of the fight against fascism. However, they launched the Battle of Catalonia and they seized Catalonia. And George Orwell, who, was, a British intelligence figure, just completely, he was just a propagandist for British intelligence. He's the guy who wrote 1984 and Animal Farm and all of that. He was there with the POUM. He fought with the POUM and he helped them seize Catalonia. And then he wrote a book demonizing the Spanish Republic and demonizing Stalin called The Battle of Catalonia. Homage to Catalonia, that's widely circulated in Britain, demonizing the Spanish Republic. The other thing that's interesting is the CNA, the anarchist group. They were based largely among the Spanish peasantry, and they were infamous for taking revenge against the Roman Catholic Church in a particularly vicious way. The Catholic Church was seen as propping up feudalism, and so when the anarchist labor unions, when they would seize an area, they were known to crucify priests and nuns, to rape nuns, to, just engage in really horrendous anti-Christian atrocities. And those atrocities were used by the fascists to justify support for Franco. And Winston Churchill, he, in his writings, he denounces the Spanish Republic for allowing these horrendous atrocities against the church. And that all over the world, the way that Franco is able to build up support and the way the fascists are able to build up support is to say, look what the communists are doing to priests and nuns in Spain. It's actually the anarchists. And the anarchists appear to have been part of this fifth column that was actually being boosted by the fascists in order to make kind of horrendous atrocity propaganda that could be used to justify the overthrow of the Republic. And that's particularly interesting as well. But the narrative is, that we have, if you go to college and you take a leftist course, you're going to learn that, well, the Spanish workers were going to rise up and they were going to have true socialism, but evil Stalin made it just a fight to defend the Republic, and so the workers lost their energy, and that's why Franco took over. That's the George Orwell narrative. That's Trotsky's narrative. What they're leaving out is that Nazi Germany and Italy were giving funds to Trotsky and to the anarchists to destabilize the republic from within, and that the communists were doing everything they could to try and hold the republic together, and that the Soviet Union sent guns and weapons to Spain to fight the fascists. Mexico also came to the aid of Spain, but no other country did. And that was like one of the main things communists around the world did is they raised money for Spain. And the U.S. Congress passed the Neutrality Act, which made it actually a crime to support the Spanish Republic. It's pretty wild. And that the Spanish Republic was really left out to dry. And when the Spanish Republic fell, that's when, at that point, the Soviet Union had to sign a non-aggression pact with the Nazis because the West was not going to support them. The West couldn't support Spain against Franco. So at that point, they needed to do something to buy time because they knew they couldn't count on an alliance with the West. And yeah, Trotsky was trying to undermine the Spanish Republic. Trotsky opposed the idea of an anti-fascist united front because he has this notion of the class line. You know, you shouldn't ever align with any capitalists. So there's no, they would say there's no such thing as a democratic bourgeoisie. There's no difference between a fascist bourgeoisie and a democratic bourgeoisie. It's all bourgeoisie. They're for independent workers' power from below. That's the Trotskyite line. And that was used to undermine the Spanish Republic, to undermine the fight against Hitler, during the Second World War. The Trotskyists were working with John L. Lewis to organize miners' strikes that hurt the war effort in West Virginia and Kentucky and other places. And it was in the name of the class line, which is a big theme in Trotskyism, which is that's not Lenin. Lenin had this line about imperialism and such. Trotsky is going back to his roots. So that's classical Marxism, workers versus bosses. And that Trotsky was never really a Leninist. Lenin had the whole thing about imperialism and globalism and national liberation. Trotsky never really agreed with that. Trotsky was always trying to hold on to the Western Marxist notion. He believed in social democracy.
I'm going to share something, and then I'm going to ask Marty, who I noticed has been very active and I'm sure has some thoughts to share. But I'm going to share some thoughts as well first. On the back in 2000 and end of 2010, amidst the Occupy Wall Street thing, I was challenged to a debate on a college campus in what was it? Where was I now? Was it Alberta? And it was a Trotskyist radio show, and we were like fighting for Glass-Steagall restoration, like getting some concrete plans to break up the banks, and it's like, okay, if everybody's like organized, let's actually call for concrete plans. So we get pulled into a debate, and at a certain point, or a friend of mine it's me and another organizer who are debating, and he just asks, so what exactly do you want when the proletariat take power? Like, what is your plan? What are you going to do? And our debate partner sort of just stops dead in his tracks because he was just ranting and citing a variety of communist economic theory and other things and assumptions about how the masses are organized to move and the pressure cooker. And then he calls his producer in and says, hey, what do we do when the people take over? And the guy just like walks into the the studio and says, I don't know. And that sort of like spoke very loudly to the big giant blank spots in the paradigm. And also why it makes it useful, because these were like two honest young guys. They really meant well, but they just didn't think about that. And they were antagonistic to the idea. They were like, it's very elitist if you propose concrete things, although Trotsky did seem to have very concrete ideas of what he wanted. So that's interesting. But the other thing that I just want to share was that you had in Canada the Louis Papineau Mackenzie Brigade. That was the anti-fascist brigade sent in by the Canadian Communist Party to go and fight, and people like Sam Carr and other Communist Party organizers of Canada, who was a member of Parliament, organized this brigade. And they were at war with the Fabian Society of Canada, because in the 30s, during the Great Depression, you had what was set up as the Canadian Fabian Society, set up by 5 Rhodes Scholars, one of whom goes on to manage a young Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And there's this battle that's been almost wiped out of like records between the Fabians. Their political party in Britain, it's like Labour, but in Canada it was the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which then became known as the NDP, the Orange Party. And they're battling over who's going to represent Labour, who's going to represent the disenfranchised and the poor, and you've got them at war with those who are actually organizing to send out thousands of Canadians to go and fight to stop fascism. Practically, they're always being sabotaged by this group, and something happened. And I'm not too sure what that is, but by the mid 60s, like the proper, I guess, the healthy Communist Party members, they're like wiped out. Some are given jail times under the Guzenko affair, which is just made up by British intelligence. But it's only these potent Communist Party members who are like wiped out, and they're the ones bringing Paul Robeson into Canada. So just that observation, and I was wondering, based on that, number one, I don't know if you have any comments about what I experienced in my debate in 2010. Number two, John Dewey, who seems to be running the new school out of Columbia. He's also part of the American Fabian networks that are penetrating the United States and setting up this fifth column inside the U.S. It seems that John Dewey is playing a big role at growing, incubating this woke Frankfurt School operation, but at the same time, he's running the Dewey Commission to defend Trotsky against the claims made by Stalin about these, the fifth columnists and other things. In 38. Is there anything you could say about Dewey, the Fabians in America, and the broader like conduit of the Fabian Society operation and the Trotskyists?
So I'll answer the Dewey part first, and then I'll go back to what you said before. John Dewey was hired by Trotsky to run the Dewey Commission, which was Trotsky basically paid John Dewey to put on like a show trial to clear his name. And the Dewey Commission, is largely considered to have just been, it was theater, basically. There was one person on it who was not a Trotskyist who actually resigned in protest of it. And it was, Trotsky ended it by giving this very fiery speech. I stake my life on this commission. If they find me guilty, I will go back to the Soviet Union and face the death penalty. It was all just theater. But what's funny is John Dewey ran it for Trotsky. It was just a PR thing for Trotsky, basically. And then immediately afterwards, John Dewey and Trotsky had a big falling out. And then Trotsky wrote the book, Their Morals and Ours, against John Dewey. And it looks like the falling out. John Dewey was on the Allied side of the Second World War, and Trotsky was starting to become on the Axis side, is what it looks like to me. And that, it's John Dewey was this big social democratic intellectual who was associated with education and was also associated with Fabianism, the kind of the social democratic side, and was critical of the Soviet Union, but was willing to engage with certain aspects of Marxism. There was a weird, the Labour Party of Britain kind of had an alliance with the Soviet Union. Like Sidney and Beatrice Webb wrote books like defending the Soviet Union and such. And so, because of the Soviet Union's anti-fascist stance and because Britain was going to align with the Soviet Union during World War II, you had some Fabians that were sympathetic to Stalin, you had others that were kind of hedging their bets and trying to be anti-Stalin. And that's how I would interpret that whole thing. But as far as the second thing that you said, right. My organization, we call ourselves the Center for Political Innovation. And we have been kind of cutting new ground because if you just do the communist thing, right, you just call yourself a communist party, you're kind of cursed because communism as a brand is kind of dead. And that part of the reason for that is the dialectical materialist worldview. Dialectical materialism views all history as driven by conflict, right? And if everything is driven by conflict, it's very hard to have reconciliation. It's very hard to build a solid block, right? And that the dialectical worldview is very much a heritage of the French Revolution. The so-called left comes out of the French Revolution. Red as the color of the French Revolution. That's the red flag. It's the red cap of the Jacobins. And the dialectical philosophy. And so what you were seeing with those guys, that's dialectics, right? Why would we're not trying to fix things. We're just trying to struggle, to have conflict. Well, what do we do when we take power? Well, we don't think about that. We're just focused on the conflict. That's dialectical thinking right there. So that's how I would interpret that. That is the dialectical materialist philosophy, which I do think has hung like a kind of a curse over the communist movement, and that Trotsky really held on to it, and that Stalin was starting to move away from it. Deng Xiaoping moved away even further, and that I would argue that wokeism is just a concentration of the dialectical worldview. That's what wokeism is. Whereas, what's that?
I think that was Martin Seif saying that's wonderful. He was
yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, well there you go.
No, that's very well said. Thank you. And I'm not, so many of your responses and are so clippable. I'm going to make a bunch of little smaller micro videos after this is done. Right. This is very high value stuff. Marty, I know that you've been very active in the chat. Do you have any thoughts or questions you'd like to toss out at Caleb?
The answer is one question and lots of applause. I apologize. I'm going to have to catch most of your podcast in retrospect because of prior commitments, I was only able to tune in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so. And even there, I'm blown away. Thank you so much. Because you have revealed to me, you've thrown light on an enormous number of events that in my own life I've witnessed from the University of Oxford to Moscow. And you've made sense of historical issues that I think nobody has seriously addressed before. So again, just from my own very limited so far perspective on this, thank you. I think your work is an enormous achievement. I would appreciate, I have some other comments to make, but first of all, I would like to put my question, or it's not even a question, it's more our request for more material, and you may well have discussed it earlier before I was able to tune in. But your throwaway comments almost, your casual comments on Trotsky's true role in the Russian Civil War as the front man for the Red Army. This, I've never heard anyone make this point before, ever. And I'm convinced you're correct, because you make sense for me on one of the great military and historical puzzles of the Civil War. Here is this man with absolutely no background in military studies or experience anywhere whatsoever. And he doesn't even have a rapid learning curve. All of a sudden, he appears to be, this is the conventional wisdom, he's catapulted up to the top of the Red Army, he's a military genius, he wins all these victories. And then his military skills vanish completely forever. He's a totalitarian bungler. He has no ability as a politician. He has no ability as an administrator. He is chaotic. He's a liberal intellectual blowhard. Just even from tuning into you, one thing that explodes in my head is the parallels between him and Mazzini and Garibaldi and all these liberal and the revolutionaries of 1848 across Europe. Trotsky fits into this pattern. Ideally, he is a liberal romantic internationalist, setting off revolutions with absolutely no idea of what their second and third order consequences will be. He believes in giving endless speeches. Menachem Begin actually comes from this background in Israel. I was put on his blacklist back in the 1920s for a critical article I published in a high-profile, very small journal at the time. But I called him a romantic, frustrated, romantic Polish gentleman with dreams of revolutionary grandeur. And I think Trotsky fits this pattern too. But in the Civil War, you explain the true significance of Trotsky, because we don't see his fingerprints on the Red Army. He has no apparent impact whatever on command and control, apart from, giving speeches, as you say, in a million different places and turning up. He doesn't seem to have played a key role in selecting senior commanders or encouraging the promotion of able ones. He is totally ignorant of tactics. He is totally ignorant of strategy. He is totally ignorant of weaponry. In conventional military analytical terms, he doesn't exist. And yet we are told he is the military genius who wins the Russian Civil War. But I think you've answered this mystery as well as too, because the huge influence academically of Trotskyites, Isaac Deutscher in Britain, John Dewey, and so many others in the United States, in penetrating the Anglo-American and no doubt Canadian intellectual elites as well. They worship Trotsky, and they build him up as this military genius. Of course, they know nothing about military affairs themselves, but nobody holds them to account, and they do not hold Trotsky to account either. And I think, again, you have solved, even in casual comments, uh, these huge conundrums. And I apologize again for having to come in late. I would be would ask you to, if you can, to elaborate some more on this. And I apologize if you've already done so, and I missed it. Secondly, just before I go off, 2 or 3 personal comments from my own experience and observation. I can confirm very much your own caution on the role of Trotsky on Russian fascism. Russian fascists certainly exist, and they became they're still hugely important today, and they become important from the collapse of communism. And I was in a strange position to see this, because I was, improbably enough, in favor with them in the early 1990s. I was in Moscow a great deal at that time as the Soviet Affairs chief correspondent of the Washington Times. And I was astonished at the access I was given, because the Washington Times, of course, they loved the neocons too, but they also had paleocons on board. But they were generally a pro-Reagan, pro-Bush, pro-US imperial communism is evil paper. They were not anti-Russian, but they were very anti-communist in those days. I mean, they've gone through their own evolution since, as have I. But when I was in Moscow, what I found was the perspective the Russian right took, and again, they had a limited perspective. They were just emerging into full contact with the Western world themselves, was we are anti-democratic, anti-American, anti-Western fascists, and proud of it. This was their own very simple view at that time. Their views, of course, evolved too, but this was their attitude. The Washington Times is the conservative, patriotic newspaper of Washington, D.C. Therefore, the Washington Times, in fact, was strongly pro-Jewish, strongly pro-Zionist, strongly pro-Israel. But they weren't looking at this. Their attitude was the Washington Times is patriotic, pro-American, and conservative. Therefore, it must be anti-Semitic and fascist, as we are. You represent the Washington Times, Mr. Seif, so you're a good guy. And they gave me access. And they did not just give me access. They published a book of mine I was never able to get published in America. And it was a book, the only place it's ever been published is in Moscow in an outlet called Uchitilskaya Gazeta. They even paid me a couple of $1,000 for publishing it at the time. And it was a book I've never been able to get it published in English called It's Not Fascist in Any Way. It's The Last Red Hope. Mikhail Gorbachev and why perestroika and glasnost failed and why they were doomed to fail in the first place. And nobody in liberal imperialist America would publish this because, of course, they saw Gorbachev's version of communism, kind of a tamed, castrated communism, which would play ball with America. And basically, the way I think now, the way Hammerstein looked on Louis Napoleon as his own castrated, tame Napoleon to harness France for the British Empire, they saw Gorbachev and his successors the same way. I'm sorry, Matt, go ahead.
No, that's good. That you gave a lot to Caleb to chew on, and I really appreciate always your contributions, Marty. That's okay. Unparalleled. And on that note, Caleb, do you have any thoughts about what Marty just went through? And also, do you see Gorbachev as being sort of a revivalist of Trotskyism of some sort or another in the 90s? Or is that something different in your mind?
I guess just to answer that part that you just raised, Gorbachev did rehabilitate Trotsky. Yeah, there was an official in the final years of the USSR. Gorbachev did actually say that Trotsky was innocent, and they were rehabilitating various people that Stalin had killed. And Trotsky was one of the last to be rehabilitated, and I believe it was the Gorbachev government that did so. And Jerry Healy, it's in my book, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, I have an appendix about Jerry Healy, who was the leader of a British Trotskyist group, who was one of the most important pro-Palestine activists, who they're still demonizing years after his death. DSA published a slanderous hit piece book on him during the 2024 election cycle that was paid for by Israel. It actually says in the acknowledgments it was paid for by the Center for Jewish Studies, which is a pro-Zionist outlet. And they published a screed against Jerry Healy. And I talk about Jerry Healy, in the book as an appendix, as kind of an example of somebody who comes out of Trotskyism but did a lot of very, very good work. But Jerry Healy, after Trotsky was rehabilitated, he was flown over to the USSR in 1987, 88, 89, and was giving lectures at Soviet universities as an open Trotskyist. Because of Mikhail Gorbachev's rehabilitation of Trotsky, that was allowed, which I think is very, very interesting. But what is widely understood is in the final years of the USSR, the official party line was not believed by anybody, and it was just kind of put out there in kind of a robotic way. Beneath the surface, there were two factions, the hardliners and the moderates. And the hardliners, most of whom were becoming Russian Orthodox nationalists, very conservative Russian nationalists. And they liked Stalin because they saw Stalin as like a great czar, etc. And then those were the hardliners. And then the moderates were becoming Western leftists. They were becoming, they were in awe. And that Gorbachev, I think in his final years, he said he wanted the USSR to become a welfare state. And he was convinced that if they dissolved the Soviet Union, the USA would let them just kind of transition to becoming another Norway or Sweden. And they didn't realize they would be opening the door up to neoliberalism and just kind of complete economic demolition. And that I think rehabilitating Trotsky was just a sign that the Soviet Communist Party was more and more under the reformist leadership that was just watering down what they believed in and ultimately would throw in the towel. And that at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union could have stayed intact if the Communist Party was able to mobilize the masses to defend it. The public voted to keep the Soviet Union overwhelmingly, and then they elected the National Salvation Parliament, or the National Salvation Alliance in 1993 to stop Boris Yeltsin's economic demolition of the country, the neoliberal reforms. And then Yeltsin dissolved the parliament. You had the constitutional crisis of 1993. But it's out of that crisis, the constitutional crisis, Black September 1993, that there's a phrase that gets used. It's almost an obsessive word of the DSA woke crowd now. The Red-Brown Alliance. Have you heard this? The Red-Brown Alliance, right? And when Yeltsin liquidated the Russian Duma because they elected communists and nationalists who didn't agree with his economic demolition policies, who didn't agree with the shock therapy policies, Yeltsin dissolved the parliament and he said it's a red-brown alliance. It's Nazis and communists together. And I mean, some of these Russian nationalists who were elected were anti-Semitic and said anti-Semitic things, sure. But that's not why the Russian people voted for them. They voted for them to stop the economic austerity. Exactly. And the Communist Party was elected for the same reason. And the National Salvation Alliance was to stop the economic demolition of the country. And the memo got sent out that if you support the Russian parliament, you're supporting Nazis and communists and Nazis together, this red-brown alliance. And you'll notice that at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, there was almost no solidarity with the Soviet Union or with the elected Russian Duma from communists around the world. The Communist Party of the United States nominally supported the Soviet government, but in a very mild, weak way. And Angela Davis and all their leaders quit the Communist Party. And the Workers' World Party in the United States had demonstrations, but that was about it. And the French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, the Spanish Communist Party had all denounced the Soviet Union in 1978 and become Euro-communists. And you'll notice then, as the Soviet Union's falling, all these communist parties just started liquidating, right? The Italian Communist Party liquidated almost immediately, and they just, the British Communist Party officially liquidated. And that these communist parties had been taken over by intelligence agencies and were kind of used as a vehicle for the West to boost the reformist Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party. That's what was going on. Angela Davis, the various Italian Communist Party leaders that were academics, that were, the International Gramsci Society was set up. This was a Congress for Cultural Freedom CIA program run by Pete Buttigieg's father, Joseph Buttigieg, out of South Bend, Indiana. And they were using the communist parties to boost the reformist wing and to kind of insert this kind of cultural liberal Western interpretation of Marxism into the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union fell, all these European communist parties just dissolved. They just became just regular social democratic, or in some cases conservative parties. They just liquidated. And the British Communist Party, when they dissolved, their statement dissolving, they said the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 had been, like, I believe the term was a mistake of historic proportions. It had been one of the greatest mistakes in history or something. And that all the communist parties had been taken over by intelligence, and they were just, liquidating one by one, and they didn't do any activism to defend the Soviet Union. And that's an important thing to remember. The Soviet Union's the communist parties, the Communist International, had been like an international network of parties that were to support the Soviet Union, that had been created to support the Bolshevik Revolution. And gradually, over the course of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, all these parties became taken over by Western intelligence agencies. They maneuvered in there, and part of it was convincing the Soviet government that these, that there were factions within the American state or within the Western governments that were friendly to them. And part of it was the years of lead in Italy, where the Red Brigades made the Italian communists fear for their lives, right? The Red Brigades were murdering leaders of the Italian Communist Party. So the elected representatives of the Italian Communist Party were fearing that they would be assassinated, and they were relying on the Italian security services to protect them more and more and more. I think that's very relevant with the political culture in America, where we're seeing an escalating culture of political violence. And just gradually, the communist parties of the world came under the control of the West and were being used to boost the Gorbachev wing. And then ultimately the Soviet Union fell, and they no longer served their purpose. And they no longer, served that purpose. I believe the top FBI informant in the U.S. Communist Party, he was, I'm trying to remember his name. There was a book describing his operations, Operation Solo. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan for his efforts controlling the Communist Party for the FBI. It's particularly awful. The official communist movement was gradually taken over by the West, and that's one thing that's really important. And that is, I've talked about, Luigi Mangione, this case of Luigi Mangione in the United States. That's really dangerous, because you couldn't have had the murder of Charlie Kirk and the reaction to the murder of Charlie Kirk without the Luigi Mangione case first. I don't know if he's guilty. I don't know if he actually did it. I have my doubts about his guilt, honestly. Regardless, Luigi Mangione is accused of murdering this insurance executive on the streets of Manhattan. And the way it was sent out, all the leftist groups celebrated and cheered for this. It used to be understood that the Leninist position on lone wolf terrorism was that you oppose it, right? And that was routine. When an act of left-wing terrorism happened, the Leninist parties would quote Lenin and quote Marx about opposing individual terror. That didn't happen. And after Luigi Mangione was charged with killing Brian Thompson, it was all over social media that this was to be celebrated. There were people intentionally distorting quotations. I know the American Communist Party, the ACP, which is a very suspicious outfit, they distorted and took out of context Leninist quotes and made memes and videos supporting Luigi Mangione, assuming that he's guilty, but saying it was a good thing to murder Brian Thompson. And that psyched up the left to believe that assassination was justified. There's already this culture that, that conservatives and Trump supporters are fascists and Nazis, so it's okay to murder them, it's okay to beat them up. But then you had the Luigi Mangione case, and now we have the celebration of the murder of Charlie Kirk. And what's scary is, other than the Revolutionary Communist Party, the RCP, which is tied to French intelligence, almost all the communist parties have said almost nothing about the murder of Charlie Kirk. Because they're afraid of offending the wave of people that are celebrating the murder. They're afraid that they'll alienate and they'll get attacked by the social media mobs that are celebrating the murder of Charlie Kirk. It's utterly horrifying. A basic point of Leninism is, you say that, when I was a leader of the Workers' World Party, there was a horrendous murder of 2 NYPD police officers in New York City. And I did what we always did. And I said, look, we don't endorse this kind of activity. Individual terrorism will not stop police brutality. We need a mass movement. We did say that, we feel the NYPD is perhaps using this murder to make propaganda, and that they've created an atmosphere of violence, etc. But we always condemned lone wolf assassination. That has been lost. Leftist groups in America no longer condemn lone wolf assassinations. They no longer condemn terrorism. And that's shocking to me. I find that shocking, but that tells me they're controlled by intelligence, because it's intelligence agencies that carry out lone wolf assassinations, not mass organizers.
Yeah. extremely important points. And I was thinking while you were speaking just about the murder of Aldo Moro, too, whose body was left geographically at the exact halfway mark between the headquarters of the Socialist Party of Italy as well as the Nationalist Party headquarters, and directly mathematically at the midpoint of those two locations was where the car with his dead body was located, the Prime Minister of Italy, as a clear message. Because what was he trying to do? He was trying to create a coalition of the left and the right, who are all a common view that no, we need economic justice. We got to fight against this dismantling of our industrial base and this new type of paradigm of anti-humanism that's coming about. And you had to organize to bring back sanity. And so that he had to be eliminated using the Red Brigades. Ironically, Maoist Leninists who are useful idiots deployed to go and build targets.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I spoke up at the time of the Luigi Mangione case. I wrote, my book, The Murder of Brian Thompson, or The Killing of Brian Thompson and the Danger of an American Years of Lead. Amazon wouldn't publish it with this title, so I had to give it a new title. I called it The Danger of an American Years of Lead, and they published it. And there's been renewed interest in that book since the Charlie Kirk assassination. And I've noticed that now people are referencing the years of lead a lot more. And so I kind of introduced that into the conversation, which I'm proud of. The Center for Political Innovation, we're having a national day of action on October 4th to support continued peace talks with Russia, as well as to support the prosecution of John Bolton. And we've called a National Day of Action. We had a National Day of Action on August 15th to support the Alaska Summit. And we had people in 8 cities. This time we're hoping to have people in even more cities. And we have signs, "Thank you, Tulsi Gabbard," because without Tulsi Gabbard and her work in the intelligence agencies, her work to restrain the CIA and revealing the Russiagate hoax, none of what has happened in Alaska would be possible. We have to push for the best. There are a lot of sinister forces within the Trump administration. One of my biggest concerns right now is we have the regular left, which have at this point just become a wing of wokeism. Whatever the woke people do, they just try to do it louder, or they try to set up the permit and get the stage. But there's a couple of new groups that have emerged that I would say are a little bit more dangerous. One of which is the ACP, the other which is this group called RCA, Revolutionary Communists of America, and they're a Trotskyist group that's kind of rebranded. And both of these groups, they don't do any political education, but they very much go around, look at us, we are communists, look at our hammer and sickle, look at our red flag, and they go around kind of staging images. And our assessment is that the neocon wing of the Trump administration, in order to build public support for regime change wars, because Trump was elected on a platform of opposing that, because his supporters don't want wars around the world, it would take some kind of January 6th-like event, some kind of false flag provocation with a group of very, very clearly communist people doing it, right? You need a group of people waving red flags and hammers and sickles and saying, look at us, we're communists, that can be manipulated and controlled. And if you could carry out some kind of January 6th with communists as the perpetrators, that would then psych up the Trump base to then go ahead and support an invasion of Venezuela, perhaps escalating against China. And that is my concern. Is it looks like, in addition to the regular layer of communist groups that are just part of the woke apparatus, there's a couple sleepers, you could call them, that could be used for some kind of false flag event to justify interventions.
And I would add too, as well, while this is happening with this clear fingerprints of 3-letter agencies behind radicalizing groups to capture the energy of those on the left, you also have similar things on the right. People have probably seen the images, the videos of this Patriot Front brigade, these battalions of men who always wear masks with patriotic shields and matching khakis, clearly smelling of Fed, but just showing up in areas all over America, a lot of it Washington, D.C., but elsewhere too, without very much of an audience. Usually the only audience are media channels, like who know that that's where you have to go get footage for the nightly news, but are definitely part of a nudging operation to try to channel the rage and the feelings of the conservative base to radicalize them, to maybe next time you point a gun at an Antifa activist coming at you, instead of just pointing it, you pull the trigger, to really just get the next level of chaos going. And both sides are being played right now. I mean, I've heard people like Ian Burlingham doing circuits on all sorts of podcasts, really nudging his audience towards getting ready to kill, to fight, to kill, and to die the oppressors being those immigrants who are being sent into America, that we have to be prepared to become real men, real knights, and fight and kill in this oncoming civil war. So that's something that we see in a variety of ways, but we have to really be aware of its historical expression, and then see it again with the exact same formula manifesting in the same world that we're living in today. And for that, Caleb, you're doing impeccable work. The Day of Political Action, the National Day of Action, when is that again?
October 4th.
October 4th. Okay. So we're going to have in the description box under this video, everybody watching this on YouTube, go to the links. You can contact Caleb's people through I'm sure the website that will be in the link under the description box. You can buy Caleb's books as well. I know that somebody, I think it was V here in the audience, asking about how do we know more about this? Well, V actually asked, here, I'll actually ask V's question because he asked me to ask it and I forgot. Oh, here it is. How have Trotskyists successfully managed to rewrite history and negatively impact ordinary person's understanding of history? And are there any books, including yours, which will help clear up the misconceptions created by... I lost the rest of it. I'm sorry. But so if you could send me any links to books that you recommend, including your own, people could buy those. Get involved with the National Day of Action. Caleb, any last words, last thoughts before we tune it out for today?
Well, I just wanted to end with kind of a story of something that happened when I was in New York City that I included in the book because I thought it was an important way to end the book. And that's, my encounter with the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline. The only time I've actually met exactly, one of these. I was in a New York City diner in the year of 2012, I believe, maybe 2012, 2013. And I was talking with someone, about politics. And I was in a New York City diner, and there was this older man in the diner with a cane, and he was kind of looking across the diner and paying kind of a close attention to us. Finally, he walked over to the table. And he said to me and the person I was sitting across from, he said, are you guys communists? And he said it in this very hushed voice. Are you guys communists? And we said, yes, we're communists or whatever. And then he said again in this very hushed voice, my father was a Trotskyist. And he proceeded to tell us about how his father, he had grown up in a conservative family in Manhattan, and he knew his father as a conservative. His father wrote for National Review magazine and was just a conservative. And one day as a young man, this older guy who was talking to us in 2012 had gone to an anti-Vietnam War rally. And he didn't want his father to know he had been there because his father was quite a conservative. He came home and somehow his father found a communist newspaper he had bought at the rally. He said the old man was quite nervous to see that his father, who he knew as a conservative, would have this publication. And his father saw the communist publication and burst into tears, and then started to tell him about when he was a young man attending City College in New York City in the late 1930s, and he'd been a Trotskyist. And how, despite his views changing, and despite the fact that he viewed himself as quite a naive youth back in those days, he did remember those as the best years of his life, when he had stood for something and when he believed in something. And he said it was very odd. He said he never would have guessed in a million years that his conservative father, who wrote for National Review, had once been a Trotskyist. And he had found it out in this very weird roundabout way. But what he'd seen in his father's eyes was a nostalgia for when at least he had believed in something, at least when he'd stood for some real truth. And that kind of tells you that neocon pipeline, when I talk about philosophical irrationalism, when I talk about the belief that there is no real truth, there's just great intellectuals, the belief that the masses are sheep that are going to persecute the great intellectuals, that ideology, that is, people talk about the oligarchical view of mankind. It is a particularly pessimistic and dark place that people get into. And I remember that conversation with that old man talking about how his father was a Trotskyist and had burst into tears when he saw the newspaper. And that's kind of stuck with me as kind of an anecdote. And that was the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline. That's my direct encounter with it. I did see the third camp Trotskyists around at demonstrations and stuff. But as far as the Trotskyists who ended up as conservatives, that's my only direct encounter with it. But it says a lot about what it means to be an organizer, and that as much as I'm not a fan of Trotskyism, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party by James Cannon, if you read it, it's quite interesting because his critique of the third camp Trotskyists, the New York intellectuals who became neocons, he emphasizes party patriotism and the importance of having an organization, and how that seems to be what the neocon crowd, the eventual neocon crowd, just couldn't understand, that it's important to have an organization to carry out real operations, and that the organization in and of itself is an end to be celebrated. It's not simply a matter of the ideas the organization promotes, it's the organization itself. And being able to carry out the operations and having the camaraderie to organize and to challenge the evils of the day and to fight for justice, and that the importance of the organization. That is something that the neocon crowd really just couldn't appreciate. It seemed to be something that was kind of divorced from their ideology, but it's really an embracement of liberalism. The liberal ideology celebrates individuals above all else, and that seems to be what's grinding us, or at least a big factor into what's grinding us into so much confusion here in the West, is that we don't celebrate the collectivity and the collective nature of humanity and our ability to solve problems as a group. So that's how I just thought I would end my remarks tonight.
Yeah, those are very wise ending remarks, and it reminded me of, as you pointed out, Stalin's dispute that we should be able to, Stalin was saying we should be able to work with the nationalist bourgeoisie. That's why he was supporting Sun Yat-sen. That's why he saw a lot to work with Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt also had a similar point against his detractors who were saying you should don't work with communists, don't do that. And he made the point that no, you have feudal communists who are like using communism as a cover for getting empire, and then you actually have nationalist industrialist communists, and we can work with the industrialists. So he had the same sort of understanding that we're all trying to create a better world for our kids. We want to get rid of imperialism. We want to increase liberty, want to increase freedom. And so we can have a conversation on these things, even though we're not communists, even though we're not, the Stalinists don't identify as capitalism, but they can agree as human beings that we have common enemies and common needs as humans first. And then we can have a creative discussion about the future based upon what do we want to create for those great grandkids. And then maybe after we get rid of imperialism and get rid of world hunger, maybe then we could have a dispute about like which type of social political structure we want to govern us, but let's deal with the war at hand right now and stop the fascists. So Caleb, thank you very much for carrying on the proper fight, and look forward to future conversations. Thank you everybody for sharing this Sunday with us.
And thank you.
Thank you.